If you exist in the Fire Emblem fandom long enough, you might hear some stories about Fire Emblem 5, about how it hates the player and is wildly unfair. And then one day, you might play it yourself and realize, wow, this game hates the player and is wildly unfair. And it's also one of the greatest games ever made by human hands.
There is no meme. This is just a threat.
I recently finished a fan hack of FE5 called Fire Emblem Thracia 776 Forseti's Cut, which basically is the Project Ember to FE5. It takes the base game of FE5, spruces in new dialogue, adjusts unit stats and growths, adjusts some maps, and essentially tries to make Thracia even more Thracia than it already was. I had a blast with this hack from start to finish, and I'm gonna want to try to encourage you to give it a shot and download it. So if you want the too long didn't watch, download this hack. The link will be in the description. It is worth it. 100%. So what exactly does Forseti's Cut do? Well, let's break it down piece by piece, starting with the map design. Now, Forseti's Cut doesn't really change anything. I'm not going to open up chapter 23 and then suddenly I'm playing Disgaea, but it does give a bunch of little tweaks all along the way. For example, in the very first map, a hole has been added to the wall near Osian's house, so that once you go to Osian's house to get the Vogue, you're not stuck with Osian being unable to contribute for the entire map, because he has to go all the way back around the wall. In chapter 5, rather than sending Brighton off on a mission to go all the way around the map for the chest, it's just right there and a way easier to get spot. It's not just tedium, some maps have other adjustments that actually factor in gameplay, like open fire is a bit less cramped, etc, etc. At no point do these maps feel like new maps per se, but every little tweak does make them that much more enjoyable. And it's not just the maps that get adjusted, it's the enemies that you fight in them. One of the developers told me that he believes that you shouldn't be able to take iron weapons and beat the entire game with it. So enemies have been spruced up in their power, and I think it feels just right. You can't just go through this game with basic tomes and iron weapons and expect to win, but they're not overtuned. Their health points are a bit more, they're armed with a bit better equipment, but they're not suddenly 20 strength, 20 speed killing machines on Chapter 6. They feel fair to take out, it's just you're gonna have to use a bit more brain power than putting someone like Shiva with a killing edge in between all of them and watching you win. And this also factors into the fact that on average, the player will have access to better equipment. First of all, since the enemies are better armed, you can capture and steal their goods, so now you're better armed. And on top of that, villages and chests have also been adjusted all over to give better rewards on average, so it doesn't feel like the enemies are unfairly powered up, it feels like you have to use the tools that are given to you to their fullest potential. And by the time you do face those incredibly powerful 20 strength, 20 speed enemies, it's at the end of the game where you have units capable of dealing with it. It was very refreshing to have to think about how to deal with just a common enemy, rather than saving all the thought for the bosses themselves. Any issues I had with Forseti Cut's level and enemy design were problems that were native to FE5 itself. Status staves still run rampant, and though Forseti's Cut did take strides to make certain status staves less obnoxious, specifically Salem's Sleep Staff and Tina's Thief Staff won't start bombarding you until you reach a certain point, it doesn't really change everything. And it's not that these things are unfun to go against, it's just when they're in your hands, they're completely broken. You can still warp skip the entire back half of the game if you really want to, but at the same time, I don't really know how the Forseti's Cut team would fix that. That's kind of just a problem to FE5 itself. But still, the maps are very fun to go through, and I would recommend not warp skipping them just because they're fun to do. But it's not just the enemies and maps that got changes, player units got them as well. A lot of units had their stats tweaked here and there. Maybe some base stats were increased or decreased, maybe some growth rates were adjusted. For example, Trude and Brighton are now pre-promoted units instead of just an Axe Knight and a Myrmidon. But they never take away the unit's identity. Ronin is still this weird-ass archer that doesn't do any damage, but has a 70% magic growth. They didn't change that. Miranda still shows up incredibly weak and underleveled, but will immediately blossom into one of your most powerful units if you let her. The identity of FE5 units are preserved, they're just made a little better to get to where they want to be. None of the adjustments feel too crazy, but they all feel like they matter. Linoan has an authority star that she didn't before. Xavier has 2 authority stars. Kane and Alva have personal skills to try to make them suck a little less ass. It really feels like these units have their distinct feels and aren't too broken. The only units that are gonna trivialize anything are the units that are always supposed to do that. Zed and Galzus don't really slow down in this hack, but they were never really going to. That's the whole point of the unit. But in addition to tweaking existing character stats, Forseti's Cut adds 3 new playable characters to the roster, and they were all characters that were in the game's data, just never in the game itself. Gunnar, Asbel's grandfather, Daisy, the substitute thief from FE4, and Acelio, Daisy's brother. These units are all very solid to use in their own right. Daisy in particular is a ton of fun to use, coming in early in the game as a pre-promoted rogue and sort of taking the Wolf and Sedgar approach of being a pre-promo with really good growth rates. She was a ton of fun to use, and honestly, they don't feel out of place. They're integrated very naturally. Forseti's Cut also adds a lot of personal weapons for units that didn't have any before. Which, given that this is the game where someone like Osayan gets a personal weapon even though he doesn't matter to anything at all, I don't think it's entirely unwarranted, and for the most part, they don't really feel overtuned. Miranda and Conamore are not suddenly overpowered because they have personal weapons. Though there is one exception for this, and I think it's the new bow that the Forseti's Cut gave to Ronin and Tanya. Tanya and Ronin get a proof weapon called a Tathlum, which has the accuracy superior to an iron bow, might almost as much as a silver bow, 60 uses, an effectiveness against mages, and plus 10 speed on equip. Now, Ronin and Tanya are still both archers, so they're already a weak class, but Tanya just wrecked so much of the game, I can't help but think it's a little overtuned. It's really the only problem I have with the proofs. All the others are completely fine and do their job well. I just think that one was a little much. But hey, all those 12 Ronin fans out there eat good here. There's also been a lot of portrait updates throughout the game, both in combat and out of combat. None of them are exactly groundbreaking, they just look a little nicer. In combat, their color palettes are a bit more appealing. They're all very nice. The only portrait and palette update that didn't really work is for Marty, and it's actually entirely due to a glitch. I don't know if it's been patched out by the time that I make this video, but Marty has a new promotion into Berserker off of a map event, and it mistakenly gave him the color palette of Barath's armor, and it makes his skin look burnt so bad that Maki and Hanako look smooth by comparison. But honestly, even then, it's very clearly a glitch, and it's also kind of hilarious, so it's really not even that big of a deal. Speaking of glitches, this hack is still a work in progress. It's 100% complete and playable, it's just some places it's a little off. Like, for example, sometimes the text boxes will weirdly layer over each other, or sometimes a conversation will start that isn't even supposed to. But the funniest one isn't a glitch per se, it's just a feature still in development with Xavier. they're going to give Xavier the ability to use reinforcements, similar to Tanith in Path of Radiance, but it's not correctly implemented yet, and when Xavier uses it, he does create one reinforcement like he's supposed to, but he also creates a Sed with 3 Forsettis that doesn't move. And honest to God, that's hilarious, and that should just be what he summons normally. I mean, the hack is called Forsetti's Cut. What are you gonna do, cut the Forsetti? But again, I never ran into anything playing the game that, like, caused the ROM to hard crash. It's a very smooth experience, just with some hiccups here and there. So while the gameplay is all really good, they did also add a lot of new story content, exclusive story scenes, and a bunch of talk conversations with the cast to try to give Fire Emblem's probably flattest roster a bit more oomph. Because the base roster of FE5 kind of just had the bare minimum in characterization for about half of its roster, Forsetti's Cut was able to do a lot of neat ideas with it without feeling bogged down by pre-established canon. And the new conversations do a really good job at fleshing out these characters, and some of them are very sweet and heartfelt, like Dagdar having a heartwarming speech with Tanya about how much she means to him, etc, etc. But honestly, what this hack gets right, that I don't think a lot of people appreciate in the older Fire Emblem games, is the sense of humor. Kaga's writing gets remembered for a lot of things, good and bad, but you gotta remember this is the same man that wrote Sylvia, Samto, Holmes, and Barzilfen. He can be silly when he wants to be, and by God does Forsetti's Cut nail that aspect. Daisy, Tina, and Shanam are all a riot, and genuinely had me laughing out loud a few times at just how good they were. But in a bleak game like FE5, their humor never quite feels out of place. It genuinely feels like a breath of fresh air amidst all the more serious character-driven moments, and it's really appreciated. Their ability to write utter goofballs is something especially I wanted to highlight. And while I had a few grievances with the gameplay, I honestly can't think of anything wrong with the new writing. The characters that have established canon are held up well, the characters that don't have a lot to work with are worked with well, and the writing here made it clear that these people working on this hack love FE5 more than some people love their own husbands and wives. For example, there's a new conversation between Dagdar and Ralph that alludes to the idea that Ralph used to be a bandit in Dagdar's service. At first, I thought this was just some way to give Ralph a backstory when he didn't have one, but a developer on the hack told me that this is based off of internal game data that put Ralph as a Myrmidon and in between Dagdar and Marty in the game's files, implying he was originally going to join as a Myrmidon in Chapter 1, but that later got scrapped and reworked into him appearing as a hero. And that made me realize that they made a conversation based off of inferences from internal data, and that is a level of dedication that should tell you about the kind of people making this hack. The love for Fire Emblem 5 from the people who made this hack is abundant, and it honestly makes me wish that every single Fire Emblem gets the Project Ember and Forsetti's Cut treatment. A love letter to the original game, and honestly, I cannot recommend Forsetti's Cut enough. The only thing is if you already didn't like Thracia, you probably shouldn't play this one. Again, this is a love letter that's making Thracia more Thracia. It's not gonna convince you that Thracia's an underrated gem if you already didn't like it. But if you did, I cannot recommend this one enough. If you're still unsure, I did an LP of the entire thing from start to finish, and I'll put that link in the description as well, and I strongly recommend you give that a watch, and if you're even slightly curious, download it yourself. This is truly a great experience, and it makes me want to try even more fan hacks. Maybe I'll do that one that has Wario in it. That sounds like a good time. Before this video ends, I would like to give a shout out to two people on the Forsetti's Cut team specifically, Sed and Advent. who talked with me during my entire LP, helped with some troubleshooting on the way, and just were very fun to talk to, and I greatly appreciated their help. Thank you both very much. I hope this video was to your liking. I would also like to thank my patrons on my Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, you can help support the channel and get access to benefits like getting your name read aloud. My patrons include the likes of Adebayo Thompson, Andrew Crockett, Bean Juice, Benz Again, Dr. McBackstab, Great Riek, Hell on Heelys, Ichigo D. Camus, Jaeger Guts, Kenpachi Shira, Uzumaki Kira, Mato Kratos, Char Ansible, Frederick Sirius, Balsara Hakuman, The White Void, Despacito 2, Lysevening Bolt, Martha Valiant War Criminal, Morga Lorgan, Played Arrow, Ranger Man Sam, Shen Lu, The Fool, The World's Most Unironic 8.5 Tail Stand, Walmart Greeter, Ya Girl Olwen, Brentendo 11, Drew Hack, Firebomb Lord, Ginger, Gugu Gaga, Cornelia Milkers 92, Maple Knight, and Upscale Furry Trash. Thank you all for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.